Hi, my name is Andrew Gonowella. Welcome back to the Burn Bag Podcast. I have a very special returning guest today. General Stanley McChrystal is back on the podcast. General McChrystal is a retired four-star U.S. Army general, best known for his leadership of the Joint Special Operations Command and the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, where he developed a modern counterinsurgency strategy and led over 150,000 troops from around 45 allied countries. Over a 34-year military career, he commanded elite units, and he revolutionized interagency counterterrorism coordination, and he remains a respected voice on leadership, strategy, and national service. He now leads the McChrystal Group, which is a great organization. He's written many books. Around 4 years ago, we had a great conversation with him focusing on risk, which was also the title of his book. I do recommend you all go back and listen to that. But today we're going to be talking about the topic of character. General McChrystal has a new book called On Character, Choices That Define a Life. It's a really great read, was able to work through so much of it, so many of General McChrystal's reflections on so many different topics, and certainly a good read for this very relevant time we're in. But General McChrystal, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast.
Well, Andre, I thought we worked through this last time. Call me Stan, please. And thanks for having me.
Sure, Stan, I appreciate it. Before we start, though, I just want to extend a note of gratitude. Around 4 years ago, after the podcast, I reached out to you about some career advice because I was just a grad student. It was COVID. Everyone was unemployed. I was particularly unemployed, trying to find sort of my way around things. And you were so gracious enough to take about half an hour of your time. You have so much going on. Uh, to give me some career advice. I was sort of giving you like what's the type of job I want to do, what opportunities do I want in like national security, foreign policy. You asked me, what is your dream job? I told you my dream job. Then you told me to think about the resume that I would need to get that dream job. And you said something very prescient. You said at the very bottom of that resume would be the first job you would need. That first job is probably around 5 years away from where you are right now. So think about the 5 years that you're going to need to get there. Your mind may change in the next 5 years, but be open to many different opportunities. Be open to different places, different types of skill sets you can start to develop. And, as a result, I started to expand my job search, ended up in a space in defense innovation, where I was sort of helping the Navy with some contracts, finding new capabilities, new technologies, emerging technologies. And while it wasn't necessarily the first thing that, really piqued my interest, I gained so many great skill sets around how organizations work, how leadership works, and what we need to do as a country to get things moving faster and how to think about problem solving. And now I actually work in geopolitical risk, which is definitely what I want to do. But so much of the path there has been shaped by that first opportunity that I was not expecting to really enjoy. But, so much of that journey and the philosophy around that journey, I often relate to that conversation we once had. And I now relate that advice to so many other young folks I meet. So, General, first of all, thank you for that, because that's definitely shaped, my career in so many ways. And half an hour for you, is probably so minute. But for me, it's led to years of, legacy. So thank you.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, Andre. You were kind to say it. My fear was you were going to end the story that you went into something that you just hated and resisted me for ever since. So thanks for giving it a positive spin.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So, Stan, I'll call you Stan.
Hmm?
Your book is on character.
Yeah.
Why did you write the book? Why now? This is a very interesting time to write a book on character. You've had a lifetime of experience on this topic, but you admit yourself that you're still learning, and you want people to disagree with you on many of these topics. But why did you write the book?
Yeah, this will take a little bit of a long answer, and I apologize up front. I wasn't going to write another book, and I had done the four books, the last one being Risk. They were all sort of focused on specific things. And then I would sit in our living room with my wife. We both like to read a lot. And so we'd sit in these two chairs, and every 20 minutes or so, I would interrupt her and I would give her my opinion on some issue or some thought in life. And she'd smile and nod, and sometimes she'd say she agreed. Other times she'd just sort of smile and go back to reading. And then one day she told me to stop telling me about them and write them down. And I thought she was trying to get me to shut up, to be honest. But the reality is I started writing them in a bunch of separate essays, 800 to 1,000 words long. And I would just take an issue that I'd been thinking about and I would try to write about it. And what it did was I would start with my belief, what I thought about that issue, call it faith is one,
Yeah.
religion. And when I started writing, I thought I had one opinion. And when I wrote a logical argument, it was almost like having an argument with myself. I had to convince myself. And in the writing process, I found in many cases that my actual feelings were different than I might have said if you just asked me for a quick answer. So it turned out to be a very cathartic but instructive process for me. And so I started looking for more issues to write about. And when I finished, well, I finished a bunch of them. And I gave them to Annie, my wife, and I said, "What do you think?" And she goes, "It's a book." And I had not considered that. And I went to my publisher and he goes, "It's the book you always needed to write." And I said, "Well, you never told me that before." But anyway, here we go. And I wanted to name it What I Think About the Things I Think About. And I thought that was a clever title that would sell millions of copies. And everybody laughed at it and said, "No, that's ridiculous." But then we realized that all of the essays intersected on the question of character. And initially that was unintentional. And then I realized I'm 70 and I've gone through this arc of life where early in my life, as everyone does, I had experiences with parents in school and whatnot. Then I had a career in the military that focused a lot on developing character. West Point, duty, honor, country. And then in the military, you have a set. And so I'd had this experience of trying to develop it and then seeing the impact of it on myself and others. And so I hit this point in life and I realized it's the most important thing of all. Nothing else I learned is of importance compared to this. And so really dialing it on character became critical. And I think in our nation right now, we have an erosion of character. And we're going through this strange sort of torment because we all feel it. We all wish that the nation's character, even our personal character, was better than it is. And we're trying to figure out what do we do about that? And so this book is not a prescription. It is not, okay, here's how to fix character. But it's a series of issues and questions that I think that I've raised. And the answers that I come up are only good for me. But I think the questions could be of value to others.
No, and I appreciate you admitting that, right? This is not a prescription on character. This is about character for you, how you understand it. I mean, you have a really great autobiography you published some years ago, but in many ways, as I was reading this, this is a very different type of autobiography, but almost something that sort of hits deeper at the core of a lot of your lived experiences, because a lot of the stories you share are from throughout your life, you know, like back to I mean, your childhood, throughout your military career, and then obviously, you know, those years after the military career. But, you know, as you sort of talk about all of those different essays, that intersection of character, how do you define character? How do you define that term, one for yourself, and then also in an abstract sense?
Yeah. And I think it's key because I think, particularly in our country, we all throw the term out, but we have different definitions of it. And that can be not helpful. So I think of it as the essence of who we are. It is the core of Andre or Stan for sure. And it is measured or reflected by what we do. Meaning we can say our character is this, we can write it down, we can claim whatever we want, but it's what we actually do that reflects the truth of our character. And so I came up with my own definition of character, and it's really a mathematical equation. And what I say is character is the product of convictions. Those are your deeply held beliefs, not the things that someone just told you and you accept, you know, sort of mindlessly, but the things that you have really thought about. They are the ideas that the values that you are willing to live to or die for. And then the other part of the equation is the self-discipline you have to live to them. And the reason I make it that way is You can have the greatest convictions in the world, the most, impressive values, but if you don't have the discipline to live to them, they're irrelevant. If you know how you should treat people, but you don't, then your real character is what you actually do. And so I think that that character, there's the great Thomas Paine quote that
Yeah.
says, reputation is what men know of us, characters what God or men think of us, characters what God and angels know of us. And I think that's apt.
Yeah. So now, Stan, I want to move on into the story you shared towards the beginning of the book. Certainly a story that I was very hesitant to raise in our last two episodes, given the sensitive nature and the controversial nature of it, your departure from the military. So back in 2010, you were leading, I would say, very successful operations in the Middle East. You were a very revered general. Then this Rolling Stone sort of piece came out, and I would say you got a raw deal from that. I know Jake Tapper said the same thing, but I mean, it wasn't you who was saying this stuff. It was other folks who were saying this stuff. But, one event led to another, media firestorm, and then, you ended up departing from the military. I mean, even a movie was even made about it, right? So, I mean, I don't know if you like the movie at all, probably not, but at least Brad Pitt played you, so I wish I could say the same for me, but I mean, you begin on character with that
Yeah.
both newsworthy and deeply personal. And I mean, that type of sudden departure, you write, right? Like, I mean, there are so many of our servicemen and women who are killed in combat, who retire, but that type of departure is very different. So, how did that experience challenge your sense of identity? How did that very public experience challenge your self personal identity?
Yeah. And thanks for asking, Andre. And yeah, Pitt did play me in the movie. I've never seen the movie. Maybe I'm just being stubborn because they never talked to me before they made it. But I do tell people that the actor who played Achilles then played me. So I like that idea.
Very symbolic.
Well, I think it is. So I claim it. Uh, but what happened for people who aren't familiar, you gave sort of a capsulation, but in 2010, I was commanding in Afghanistan, all forces. And so I was a four-star general. I've been in the Army about 34 years. It had been great. And there was sort of political pressure building, but a magazine article came out in Rolling Stone magazine that depicted my team as being dismissive, if not outright disrespectful, of the administration. And it didn't matter whether the article was accurate or fair. I was in command and I was responsible. My boss, the commander in chief, did not deserve to have an article come out from one of his subordinate commanders, land on his desk that creates a firestorm. It's my responsibility that that not happen. And
Hmm.
so I owned it in that moment. Now, you talk about being expected. I thought there was always a chance I'd be killed in the years of combat. I thought there was a chance that I'd be fired for incompetence. I never thought there was any possibility I'd be removed or have to resign for something like this or any idea that I was disloyal. So it hit like a bolt of lightning, completely unexpected the angle it came from. And when it did, I flew back to the United States with my resignation in my pocket, went to see President Obama and offered him my resignation. And he was gracious about it and accepted it. And so I walked out of the Oval Office, and in an instant, I had walked in a commander, a general, a soldier, and pretty successful, confident person. And I walked out, I was none of those things. And suddenly, I'm not only none of those things, now I'm a publicly disgraced figure that was on the news every 2 minutes, the ticker at the bottom
Yeah.
of news. And it's hard to process that. You can think about it beforehand, but when it happens, it's hard to process. So I drove across the city back to where my wife was living at Fort McNair in DC. And I'd been gone and I'd flown all night to come back to go see the president. Then I go to my wife and she's standing in the entryway of the house as I got there. And I looked at her and said, Annie, it's over. Now, to give you an idea, Annie had been born in an Army hospital in Panama. She had spent her whole life with her father, a soldier. Then she married a soldier at a young age. Her three brothers are soldiers. Her sister's the widow of a soldier I served with. So this was her life as much as it was mine.
Yeah.
And in an instant, I'm telling her that her life is gone as we knew it, as mine. So we have that second, and she looks at me and she says, good. We've always been happy and we'll always be happy. And to be honest, I was stunned because I sort of expected her to either be angry at me or angry at the magazine or just angry. And she wasn't in any of that. She was calm and she just focused forward and said, here's what I think. And she set the azimuth for what has been the remainder of our life. And it's been the most helpful thing that could ever happen because it helped me set that thing. But most people are going to go through some kind of failure, whether it's a child has a problem or your marriage fails or your business fails or something. And so you are going to be at that moment that all the things you counted on aren't the same. But what I learned about it is the person who walked out of the Oval Office that day was still me.
Hmm.
I wasn't a general, I wasn't a soldier, but I had been me walking in and I was me walking out. Just took me a while to learn that. And it took time. And to be honest, it's still a little bit raw. If you describe it a certain way,
Yeah.
it still hurts. But it caused me to do a lot of reflection of what I was, who I was, but also what I wanted to be. Because I was 55 years old, about to be 56. I had enough time left in life to be something. And what I didn't want to be was a bitter old general or somebody who is always trying to relitigate some, unfair thing that happened in their past. Because what I'll tell everyone, nobody else cares. You've got your story, you're outraged about it, you tell it 100 times. Nobody else cares. They move on. They got their own lives to live. And so it's better if you figure out you got your life to live. And we were lucky enough right then, and he set the azimuth. And I've been able since then to do things and make friends and be a part of things that I think I wouldn't have done if I dog paddled in circles of bitterness.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, when you look at other sort of historical situations of that, one may think of General MacArthur being fired by President Truman. There was always that sort of sense of bitterness, up until the day he passed. And I think one thing I really noticed in your answer is the sense of accountability you took. You're taking not only now, but also at that time, right? Like in, I believe, 2010, you took accountability for that. You didn't attempt to litigate it, relitigate it. You said, hey, like these folks were under my command. I take responsibility. And I'm really curious about, how did your understanding of character up to that age of 55 sort of impact the way you handled that situation at the time? And I mean, you talk about Annie's sort of how she was your rock in those days and years really following that resignation. How do you sort of compare and contrast? I mean, like maybe say the year 2012, 2011 to '09 and 2010 in terms of, your understanding of character.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I'll go back even before that to how do you learn character? Because I think it's learned. You're not born with it. You see it in your parents. You are exposed to the ideas of it. But mostly it comes by examples that you see. I remember one commander that I worked for, a guy named Major General Bill Garrison.
Hmm.
He's the commander of JSOC years before me, and I had worked for him. And he commanded in Mogadishu in 1993 when there was the battle in Mogadishu in October of 1993. And in the aftermath of that, well, in the days up to that, the military, and he had requested some additional military assets, and they were denied by the government. And so when the actual firefight came, they didn't have all the things that they'd asked for. And in the aftermath, when there was an investigation because 18 American service members had been killed, many more wounded, they brought him in to grill him in front of Congress. And a number of people wanted him to sort of complain about not being given certain aircraft and armored vehicles and things like that. And he cut it off. He said, hey, I was in command. It was a firefight. It didn't go as I would like it to have gone. I am responsible. Don't look for anybody else. I was in command. And when you see examples like that, um, you just you get a guidepost and you bank it away. And you so I'm, if I'm ever in a position where I can assume responsibility when I should, that's the example I hope I follow.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, General, we're talking on the 81st anniversary of D-Day today. Earlier, I don't know if you've ever seen this interview, but General Eisenhower, around 20 years after D-Day occurred, he had an interview with Walter Cronkite where they basically did an hour and a half on the beaches of Normandy. Eisenhower was driving Cronkite around. And then towards the end of the interview, you see both, General Eisenhower and Walter sort of sitting against the graves, all the white crosses of just thousands and thousands of servicemen who died. And when you talk about accountability, I was just rewatching sort of clips of that interview this morning, just to process, 81 years since. And I mean, there's so much success in General Eisenhower's life. D-Day itself was a monumental success, but the juxtaposition of the ending of that interview of General Eisenhower looking somber as he's sitting against the backdrop of so many of the fallen folks that he had commanded, I mean, speaks to that idea of accountability that you're talking about, right? Uh, what you cited about General Garrison, it's a really great example of that too. But, I'd love to I'm sure you've seen that interview. I'd love to hear some of your reflections on some of that as well in the
Yeah.
context of character, on the context of accountability, even accountability amidst great success.
Yeah, that's a good. I'm going to date myself here, Andre. I remember seeing it was called D+20, and I saw it when it was
Yeah.
shown on TV in 1964. So guys can do the math. The the idea of accountability, particularly for General Eisenhower, I think many people know that before the invasion actually launched, he wrote a note accepting responsibility for failure. And he gave it to his chief of staff and he said, if the landings fail, this is the statement we are going to put out. And it basically says the landing didn't work as we hoped. I've ordered the withdrawal of the troops. The responsibility is mine. And you think about that before it executes, he realizes that he needs to take responsibility if it fails. But then you talk about success because, I had a lot of success in Iraq and let me put it this way, I got a lot of credit for things that were done that I was a part of.
We.
Wasn't the sole architect or the executor. And when I had the counterterrorist forces, they did amazing things, but we had many killed, many badly wounded, and others spent, of course, years and years from their families. And I reaped most of the credit for most of the work they did. And so, in the moment, I think all leaders, but particularly soldiers, have got to understand that D-Day was a big victory, but for those who were badly wounded or those who were killed or the families of those, it has a different feel. And so I think all of us have got to be mindful, I almost say humble, about the fact that we're responsible for the good and the bad in everything we take part in. And almost everything has a downside to it too. If you win a battle on the battlefield, you typically kill a number of the enemy and their fathers and brothers and stuff as well.
Yeah. So, now I want to sort of move the conversation into sort of your commentary, your thoughts on the ideas of fear, rules, and leadership. So, I mean, in your recent essay, I believe in the New York Times, it was titled Be Not Afraid. You distinguish between the idea of primal fear, that natural fear, and the sort of the insidious, cultivated fear, that intentional fear that shapes everyday lives. How have you personally navigated fear in moments of both crisis and quiet decision making? Because so much of that idea of fear
Yeah.
can be used to motivate. I mean, certainly war fighting, right? Certainly politics. It makes the idea of war fighting easier. You just talked about, folks who are killed. They are also fathers, brothers, now mothers, now daughters, sisters, and so on. How do you navigate that idea of fear as you decide, as you navigate crisis?
Yeah, let's take it. We'll start sort of the tactical level. On the battlefield, you are frightened by things that can hurt you, and that's natural and that's appropriate. But you're also frightened by the fact you won't live up to the expectations of your comrades. And that's a very powerful fear because you have standards that you think they have of you and you have of yourself. And every soldier is, at least in the back of their minds, worried that they won't measure up. And so that's a very real fear that actually works in a positive way to motivate you forward. The fear that worries me much more are those fears that we get a lot of time to think about. And
Mm.
those are the insidious fears. And that's when I refer to in society, if you create a society where if you are outspoken, or if you think of someone who had a lifestyle, go back a couple of decades when, gay lifestyles had to be hidden from people. There had to have been a constant fear that somebody was going to reveal that part about you. And so it would give you this sense of unease, a lack of confidence. And I can't imagine, and it doesn't just fall with that, but anything else that is considered a vulnerability that you have that might be brought out and leveraged against you. And then nowadays, as it gets more political, we have this fear that we are going to get suddenly dogpiled in social media, where suddenly somebody decides to go after Andre or Stan and they just do
Yeah.
all this stuff and you can't do much about it because many of them, all they want to do is create pain. And so they'll do that. And then there's political fear where, you get the threat that you're going to be threatened in a primary, opposition if you're in. And what that does is it shapes your behavior. And when I say insidious, you almost don't know you're doing it. Because what happens is you come up with a decision that you might have made a certain way. There's this threat of some kind of action against you if you do that, and you start to find other reasons not to do that. You start to say, well, I'm not going to do it. I'm not worried about that political pressure. I'm really not doing it because of these other reasons. And you even convince yourself. And so you start to have shaped your behavior to the point where you've done exactly what people, certain people in power would like you to do. You have limited your freedom of speech. You have limited your willingness to stand up and be involved, maybe in the civic process. And you almost could pass a lie detector saying, well, I did it you know, because I was worried about these other things. But in fact, that pall that gets cast over. Of course, I use an example in the Soviet Union during the 1930s, 40s, 50s, the Stalinist era, the secret police. They created everybody to be afraid of all their neighbors because their neighbors would report on them. And then they would be detained and they would be put in a gulag. And there were all these things that would occur. And it just built up in everybody a common paranoia. And so once a society gets paranoid, it doesn't accomplish much. And those people who are wielding that threat get disproportionate power because they have basically turned everyone into docile beings, no longer actually part of the political process.
Yeah, and I mean, you build on those topics in your chapter in the book entitled They, where you explore this idea, right, of the faceless people we fear that you just referenced. I mean, you also sort of write about the idea of faith in the chapter immediately preceding the chapter They, as a choice to believe. As you sort of say in the book, that can lead to either great good or very dangerous outcomes. I mean, when we sort of think about that, these are belief systems that we're talking about that lead to the ideas of otherness, that lead to the ideas of someone based on identity or demographic or some other quality of their life, their lifestyle, their identity that can lead to them being disenfranchised in the political uh, process. But do you always believe that the idea of fear can lead to otherness? I mean, I used to do research on sort of social media activity, on how politicians use social media, and the one trend we always noticed was like negativity was the most viral, was the most retweeted, the most liked stuff. We just loved to share those negative things. And it's harder for positive energies, for positive praises to go viral, maybe like 1 out of 5 times, right? Uh, how does fear play into otherness as opposed to other qualities?
Yeah, I think that what fear does is it simplifies things. So if you can create a person or people into something that everybody else is afraid of, then they are going to dislike them because nobody likes to have things that they're afraid of present or to have power. But they don't want to listen to them because they're just frightened. And so you depersonalize or dehumanize the individuals and you delegitimize the entire group, whether it's a race or a faith or whatever. And then your side now it becomes binary. It's us and them. And you don't want your side to really have good interaction with the other side because they might start to realize that it's not them, it's people just a bit different, but there's many similarities. So people who are trying to leverage that try to leverage make the poles as far apart as they can so that this enemy that you are opposing or killing on a battlefield is just this thing that needs killing or
Yeah.
need to be defeated and fended off. And of course, we see leaders, political leaders particularly, leverage that in every way. Look at the Ku Klux Klan. Look at the opposition to the civil rights movement. So much of that was leveraged by politicians who were trying to scare part of the white population in the South that they were going to lose something and they were going to lose their position of privilege. Now, if you were poor in the South, the position of privilege may not have seemed that great, but it was better than being African American. So you were privileged over some group and you didn't want to lose that. And so cynical politicians have been doing this forever. And what we need to do is understand that kind of messaging, whether it's Adolf Hitler against the Jews or against the communists, whether it's us, some groups against Muslims now, or any group we don't like or we fear, it becomes a useful lever.
And so now, I mean, I'm a civilian. I've never served. Uh, and when we talk about that idea of fear, right? Like after 9/11, there was a lot of fear. We went to war. How do we control those impulses of fear in the context of the military, right? Like where the job of the military is to, basically eliminate the enemy. Obviously, if there aren't any controls, then we just see horrific actions occurring. I'm certainly not asking you to comment on any one conflict, currently, but just throughout history, right? Like that's what allows for war crimes to happen, what allows for massacres to happen, and so on. But sort of in the context, right, of that like sort of mission or whatever, folks may perceive that mission to be. So how do you control those impulses? How does society control those impulses around fear when it can be tied to a broader mission?
Yeah, let's talk about the military specifically, but it also applies to law enforcement and some other
Yes.
things. Anywhere where you have real physical power, the first thing at the bedrock of everything is discipline. There used to be a convention in wars back in the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly in Europe, where opposing armies didn't target the officers of the opposing army because the battlefield, they were typically on horses around dismounted men, but you didn't shoot them, and you didn't shoot them for a good reason. Because if you killed the officers in the opposing army, it lost its discipline and it became a mob. Now, that could be effective on the battlefield, but it also became a mob that they couldn't be controlled. And if you were defeated by a mob, you were going to be treated very harshly. So discipline is the critical thing. And armies have always worked really hard to maintain that strict rules and leaders with as much discipline as they could. But the other part of that, the yin and the yang of this, is values. You have got to instill in the force a set of fairly nuanced values about the sanctity of human life, the protection of civilians, because you're asking relatively emotional young people, as you know, we all are at a certain age. You've armed them, you have trained them, you have pointed them at an enemy who you want them to aggressively defeat, and yet you're asking them not to shoot prisoners, not to shoot wounded soldiers, not to harm civilians. You're asking them to become these fighting pit bulls, but not do a series of things. And that's actually a pretty tall order, because if anybody's ever gotten in a fight, once you get in a fight, you get emotional, adrenaline
Yeah.
pump, you know. And so armies and police forces and other entities have to have a bedrock of values, really communicated a lot, and then they have to have discipline. When I commanded the counterterrorist forces, my force, the demographic was older, it was more mature. And although discipline was important, we couldn't provide the same kind of iron discipline because of the way we operated. You required self-discipline. And so each of those members had to be very much under control of themselves, and you needed to constantly reinforce values. If I knew very well that if I'd gone to my force and I'd given them a wink and a nod that says, you know, whatever you got to do, do it. A portion of that force would have taken that as me encouraging them to do things that were against the law of armed conflict. And so I had to be the opposite. I had to say, we're not doing anything that's illegal, immoral, or whatever, and continue to reinforce that.
Yeah. And I mean, sort of moving beyond this, sort of, we talk about this idea of the Great Divide that you write about in the book, where people are in increasingly divergent realities. And, I would often believe that, we have these divergent realities of, say, two different sides, but they're based on their lived experiences and their own shared truths, right? Like one person's truth may not be another person's truth, but it is certainly true to them. And, certainly, not trying to get you to comment on this particular conflict, but of course, the way this manifests itself in terms of what I'm seeing is sort of the Israel-Palestine crisis, the conflict, the situation, what's happening in Gaza, for example, right? Like, if you go to any Israeli person, they will cite millennia of trauma, the Holocaust, and October 7th, where so many civilians were killed by Hamas. And you'll go to a Palestinian now in Gaza, and they'll share with you, all the losses they've faced, their children being lost, their parents being lost, so many family members being lost. And those are both true, right? Like, I mean, Palestinian folks have lost so much in this conflict, so much over the decades. Jewish folks have had to face anti-Semitism, have faced generations of trauma. We have two sides, right? Facing generational trauma over decades and hundreds of years. And it's going to be incredibly difficult, right, to bridge that great divide between them because it's hard to bridge those truths, those conflicting truths. So it's like, how do we, I mean, bridge that great divide, not only say in like, say, a civil conflict, right? Like what's happening in Israel and Palestine, or say in Asia or in Africa and so on. Uh, how do we bridge it at home as well, right? When there are so many divergent truths. And I know that's going to be a very difficult answer because Nobel Peace Prizes are based off of this stuff. But I'd
Yeah.
love sort of your thoughts as it applies to all of these things in an abstract sense.
No, absolutely, Andre. If you think about the Palestinians and the Jews in that region, you could go back. This is a weak analogy, but some people might get it. At the end of an old movie that was made, Spartacus, back in the early 1960s with Kirk Douglas, the Romans have captured the rebellious slaves, and they save the last two, one of whom is Spartacus, and they make these two slaves fight to the death. And then the winner is going to be crucified. And so the two slaves are trying to kill each other, not just to win, but to save their comrade from being crucified. if you think of the Palestinians and Jewish people, there aren't many peoples around the world who have had a tougher time than either of those groups.
Yes.
If you think about it, they could be in one of these groups that comes together and talks about what a tough history they've had because it's different, but they both suffered extraordinarily sort of at the hands of history. And now they are put in a place where, and I know many of the listeners may not agree, both sides have a legitimate argument to make. Both sides can make an argument that is grounded in one interpretation of history or in
Mhm.
an. I sometimes tell people if you want to believe who should own the land of Palestine, it depends when you open a history book.
That's the thing.
And so my view, my personal view, is both sides have a very legitimate argument to make, and they are arguing over something that it's so hard because they haven't found a way to coexist where each gets enough that it meets the basic needs of the other. The Israelis don't think they get enough security and whatnot if they don't uh, treat the Palestinians in a way that is clearly unacceptable to the Palestinian people because of the nature of being hemmed in Gaza and the situation on the West Bank. And so it may be one of the saddest conflicts because there's not an obvious, just nobody's going to walk in and say, here's a perfect solution. We got close, with the Oslo Accords, and then in the early 1990s, and Bill Clinton got them together. And I was very hopeful then that we were going to get to a solution that was fair enough that people would go forward. But right now, what we've done is that the latest violence does two things. One, it points out the problem, which was already there, but it creates the dynamic where it's not a political or a land argument only. There are now living people on both sides who've lost brothers, mothers, fathers, and those losses, those become personal and those become generational. And so I always tell people, once you start the cycle of violence, the nature of the conflict changes because somebody has killed somebody else and you are now seeking retribution or something for that. So we're in that sad point. And, you know, I'm just not comfortable that there's a clean way out of this, particularly because I think that there are also politicians on both sides who are leveraging events for individual gain. And that, of course, just makes it worse.
Yeah, and General, I appreciate you diving into that, even though I did give you a rhetorical escape route, because I mean, when you mention Israel, Palestine, Gaza, whatever, right, that is a very triggering term, any of those, for the other side. And I
Mm.
think something that I've noticed is that an acknowledgement of the humanity of either side can trigger the worst impulses within those sides, right? Whether it's the children who were killed in Gaza, right? Like we're seeing so many videos of that, and there'll be some justification, on the other side that like, okay, those kids had to die because of Hamas or whatever, right? Or on the other side, October 7th, or the very, the experiences of anti-Semitism that Jews are currently facing, there's no empathy for that either, right? For the civilians who were getting killed then and there, or I mean, the folks who were shot in DC recently, or what we saw in Colorado, right? I mean, an acknowledgement of empathy, an acknowledgement of lived experiences, if you're on one side acknowledging that of the other, can cause so much hatred and brand you as a traitor to your
Right.
own side. And I mean, my family were from Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka had a civil war, sort of similar thing there as well. And then, you take it down a notch and you sort of see it in our political sphere, right? An acknowledgement of the lived experiences of a Republican may cause a Democrat to call you a traitor, and then vice versa, the acknowledgement of lived experiences for a Democrat may cause a Republican to call you a traitor. And, I'm not trying to both sides this, but I'm sort of talking about the
Right.
philosophical element of this, the idea of betrayal to your own group because they're acknowledging the quote unquote the others that exist, the they that exist. What are your sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, and probably very similar to yours, Andre. One of the things I learned in the counter-terrorist fight is, of course, everybody hates terrorists. Just the term terrorist
Yeah.
um, brings out this idea that they are evil people. Well, the reality is many of the people, Nelson Mandela was called a terrorist, and you can make an argument in his early days in the ANP or ANC, he was doing terrorist things. Um, so I think you've got to step back and say, okay, why are they doing what they do? What is the purpose? And usually there is a rational reason that they feel that the way they do. We used to look at suicide bombers first in Iraq and then later also in Afghanistan, and you say, well, they are just insane. They're putting on explosive vests, are going and they're blowing up civilians. That is just an absolutely psychopathic murder. Well, in reality, if you step back a little bit, that was someone who was so dedicated to some idea that they were willing to blow themselves up and kill people who they knew were innocent. It wasn't because they were just wanted to kill innocent people, most. It was because they thought they were furthering a cause and they were doing something that they thought was essential on a path to victory. When we think of the firebombing of Tokyo or Dresden in World War II, we were knowingly killing thousands and thousands of civilians because that was a necessary step on the road to what we thought was the correct outcome, which was our victory. So I think the first thing is admit that most people do things for a rational reason as a result of their life's journey. And in many cases, I think if we switch places and had their life's journey, we would have the same positions and views that they do, and we might be doing exactly the same
And
thing.
what is rational to them?
Exactly. Well, look at January 6th. I was very, very, and still very, very disappointed by January 6th. But the people who actually stormed the Capitol, I don't think were a collection of people who were all just evil in intent. I think a lot of them thought they were doing something that was generally good, and they were being incited. And here's the people I'm really critical of, people on the sidelines inciting them to something that they knew wasn't based on fact. They were leveraging mis and disinformation. But the people who are actually doing it, I think a lot of them were the customers of disinformation more than the originators. And
Mhm.
so they bear responsibility for sure, because you bear responsibility for your actions. But the reality is, I think a greater real responsibility falls with the sources of the information and the intent that they have.
Yeah, and I mean, you referenced in the conversation about war and conflict, about political leaders leveraging things to exacerbate conflict, to exacerbate divisions. I mean, obviously, everyone wants you to comment about the current political context. Uh, and, certainly, I mean, those are always interesting views, but, not to get the conversation too derailed, obviously. I mean, how do we guard against these divisions when leaders with questionable character actively seek to promote them? Because, I mean, sort of drawing back to your sort of commentary on the idea of faith, we live in a time where a lot of political leaders are almost treated as faith leaders, if not better than faith leaders. Like, I mean, I've seen this. I go to the Episcopal Church. We've gotten death threats because of certain political commentaries, folks have said against certain political leaders, right? And it's all gone sort of, I mean, excuse my language, but a little bit psycho nowadays, where like we revere our political leaders so much, even though we are democratically electing them to represent our best interests. And they may not have our best interests at heart. And I'm not talking about any one particular politician, I'm talking about the whole political class in general. How do we prevent the deepening of those divisions when leaders are actively trying to stoke them? Maybe intentionally or even unintentionally. They're doing this subconsciously or whatever.
Yeah. I think first is most of those leaders probably entered politics with a generally good intent when they started. And they thought they would be people of values and they would operate on a plane. And then they got into a system which has become corrupted. And when I mean corrupted, you are incentivized to use information like Adolf Hitler did. His mantra was keep the message short, keep repeating it over and over. It doesn't have to be true. Just keep repeating it, because after a while you pummel people with certain ideas. A good percentage of those ideas will sink in and it will radicalize people in any direction you want. And so I think many of our political leaders and celebrities and other people who are seeking to get our support or social media likes, they found, just like you talked about with negative information,
Yeah.
it's consumed more eagerly than positive information. And so they have all adapted to that reality as it is right now. So what do we do? The first point is the only people who can change it is us. None of our political leaders are really the cause of it. We are the cause. We have allowed them to operate in a way that we don't even like. They are the symptom of it. They are the result of it, because we've created a situation where we allow people to excite us and to get us to do things and to respond in ways we shouldn't. The good news is we're also the cure. And so I am arguing now for a national conversation on character.
Hmm.
And I want to start it at the local level and not run by elites or a retired general, anybody like that. I want it started in churches, in schools, on teams, in neighborhoods. And I want people just to say, first, my personal character. I am going to reflect on my own character. And the book is hopefully, a help for some people to do that. And then I'm going to demand more character of the people that I interact with in my organization or at my national level. We can demand that political leaders have a higher standard of character. We have the vote. We have the ability to contribute or not contribute. And so if we were to step back and say, nope, not everybody's character has to be perfect, nor does it have to be exactly the same, but we got to have norms. There's an area in which you can be, and if you're outside that, it's clearly bad for society, and we should reject that. We should say, you don't get elected, you don't get famous, you don't get rich, whatever it is people are after. So we have the power to do that. We just haven't figured it out.
No, absolutely. And, generally, as we round out this conversation, when all the layers are sort of stripped away from your career, your life, the titles, achievements, the controversies, the tragedies, and so on, I mean, what matters to you most at the age of 70? Like, what is core to who you are today, and that gives you the most gratification and sense of achievement?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because it evolves. And I would tell you, most of what I will do in life, I have already done. I can't change the record as it is, and I don't argue with it. I'm pretty satisfied with where I am. Where I am going forward gives me the opportunity to sort of go out with grace. Um, I would like to be thought of by the people that are very important to me. I don't care what the vast majority of people think, because I don't interface with them and they can't judge. But particularly my three granddaughters, 8, 10, and 5 years old, live next door to me. They're very important to me. And I want them, when I'm gone, to think of me in a way that is correct, accurate. I want them to understand who I was, how I was, what I did and didn't do. And I want them to be proud and respectful of that. They don't have to put me on a pedestal, but I want them to be able to say, Granddaddy he was a good guy. I want my friends to be able to say, he was what he claimed to be. Not more, but he was what he actually claimed to be. And he was of value. He was someone who, when he came into the room, we were happy to have him there, happy to have him involved. And so if I can get those, I'll be pretty satisfied, because I'm not sure anything else much matters.
General Stanley McChrystal, thank you so much for joining me here today. The General's book on character is on sale right now. We'll have a link in our description for that book, and also a link to some of our past episodes with him, because those were also really great conversations. But General, thank you.
Andre, thank you. Call me Stan.
Sure thing, Stan.